The event is being recorded and will be shared. The link of it will be shared with participants afterwards. And also you will note there will be some blogs afterwards from IDA and others involved in this event. So keep in touch on social media afterwards. The International Sign Interpreter is spotlighted here, but you can also pin them to the full screen. And the function is at the top right-hand corner of the interpreter's screen. Live captioning is also available, and there is a separate link being posted in the chat box now. We are also providing language interpretation, and you can access this by clicking on the globe icon at the bottom right of the screen next to the CC button. And interpretation is available today in English, Arabic, Spanish, and French. We kindly ask all participants to mute themselves and keep your cameras off unless you are speaking. We encourage you to please ask questions, post your questions in the chat box, and we will get to them during the Q&A session after the panel discussion. So we are here today to launch the report, the thematic report by the UN Special Rapporteur on Disability and the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in Armed Conflicts. This report assesses the protection of persons with disabilities in the context of armed conflict and examines the current application of the specific obligations enumerated in Article 11 of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and in Security Council Resolution 2475. We have a number of speakers here today, and we will have a panel discussion followed by a question and answer session at the end. So I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker. Rahma Mustafa holds a Master of Law degree in International Comparative Disability Law and Policy from the National University of Ireland in Galway. She is an independent consultant and researcher and has been working in the field of disability and inclusion for more than 9 years and has conducted and supported many development and research projects with many INGOs. Rahma will be presenting the report of the Islamic Relief Worldwide and International Disability Alliance, which is on the situation of persons with disabilities affected by conflict in Tigray. Over to you, Rahma.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'm glad to be part of this event and this panel. To share with you the findings and recommendation of our report in Tigray refugees with disability in Eastern Sudan camps. Yes, this report is commissioned by Islamic Relief Worldwide in coordination with International Disability Alliance to document the experience of persons with disabilities affected by Tigray conflict, currently residing in 2 refugees camps, Kuba and Tinediba in Eastern Sudan, with particular focus on women and children with disabilities. The goal is to identify the challenges they face in accessing humanitarian response and to identify practical recommendations to overcome these challenges. The findings of this report were identified through qualitative methods, including a desk review, interviews, and focus group discussion. The key informant interviews included 3 target groups: refugees with disabilities, including women, girls, children, and older persons with disabilities, humanitarian actors, including governmental authorities and the National Disability Council, as well as other organizations of persons with disabilities. Also, there was field visits to Eastern Sudan refugees camp conducted during March 21st to April 3rd. The available data on refugees with disabilities showed that in Hamdaid and Village 8, these are transit points. In Hamdaid, there are 7,762 refugees, Village 8, 3,077 refugees, In Umrakuba camp, where we conducted our research, there are 18,660. Out of this number, 571 are persons with disabilities. In Tinediba, our second camp of study, 19,560 refugees. Out of this number, 1,128 are persons with disabilities. Based on the segregation by age and gender, there are 33% children between age 0 and 17, 10% below the age of 5, and 63% are adult between the age between 18 to 59 years old. 4% are elderly persons above 60, and 61% are male, 39% are female. The response is coordinated by the UNHCR and Commissioner of Refugees with other humanitarian and development partners under the Refugee Consultation Forum, which include more than 45 members, including UN agencies, NGOs, national government organization, and government partners. The response also supported by the UN country team and other humanitarian and developmental partners. The response plan finalized on November 2020. The analysis of this report is guided by the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and other international frameworks on inclusion of persons with disabilities in humanitarian action, the Charter on Inclusion of Persons with Disability in Humanitarian Action, the ASC guidelines on the inclusion of persons with disabilities, and the UN Security Council Resolution 2475. Also, we analyzed the Sudan National Legal and Policy Framework that shows it requires more improvement in order to adequately address the inclusion of persons with disability in situations of risk and humanitarian emergencies. The key findings of this report show the level of inclusion of Tigray refugees with disabilities in humanitarian assistance in Eastern Sudan refugees camps, identified challenges faced by refugees with disabilities in accessing many services with regard to the identification and registration. The current system shows that the report shows that the current system for refugees registration does not collect information on refugees with disabilities. There are many problems in data collection. The staff often lack disability awareness and technical expertise and knowledge to include information on refugees with disabilities. Even when registering, refugees with disabilities said they have not been asked about their needs. They have been asked about their health problems, but nothing on their needs. Also, there are many barriers around access to information. The information and communication system are not accessible, especially the information on the availability of service or during the provision of service in the refugees camps. They are not well informed about the available service, or they do not know who and where to ask for assistance. The challenges they face, or refugees with disability face in accessing shelter include overcrowding and congestion in camps that is contributing to protection risk, including gender-based violence and increased exposure to exploitation, physical inaccessibility to shelter, which affects all aspects of their daily lives, particularly for those with physical and visual disabilities. A long distance from essential services and facilities such as water sources, latrines, health centers, and food distribution points, lack of adequate lighting to support protection and physical safety of refugees with disabilities. For WASH also, they face many challenges. They lack the WASH facilities which enable safe, dignified, and independent access. Sites are overcrowded, and there is a lack of access to safe drinking water, the inaccessibility and distance of latrines from their settlement. Also, another challenge they face. Latrines has no handles, ropes, or chairs that would enable persons with disability to use them without assistance. There is no facilities allocated for persons with disabilities or private facilities for those with limited mobility. They complain about having to wait in line for all services, including WASH, without being prioritized. Also, persons with disability reported that they did not receive individual comprehensive assessment in order to identify their assistance needs, especially with regard to WASH. And also they reported the lack of knowledge, awareness, and technical capacity among WASH actors on how to communicate with and include persons with disabilities. The challenges that they face in accessing food include the refugees with disability reported that they received insufficient food ratios. Food distribution points were far from tents, and they have had to line up for a long time to receive their food. But also the participant pointed out the lack of variety of food and the lack of consideration of individual needs for special foods, in particular for children, older people, and persons with health issues. Cash assistance, also one of the areas that persons with disabilities experience difficulties. And in Tigray refugee camps, some organizations provide monthly cash support. However, the stipend is not enough to cover basic needs, especially for persons with disability who have extra cost of disability, such as replacement of assistive devices. Others didn't receive the cash support due to lack of information on cash registration process and delivery mechanisms. With regard to health, the research has documented some positive measures by humanitarian actors in collaboration with government to ensure access to health care for refugees. However, our research indicates that most of these measures are not inclusive of and accessible for refugees with disabilities. Specialized doctors and medicines are not available. They had to go to the hospital, and they face a lot of barriers such as inaccessible and unaffordable transportation. There is no rehabilitation service nor assistive devices. Some persons with disability lost their assistive devices when they fled. Others state that they are damaged and that they can no longer use them. With regard to protection mainstreaming, an interagency team conducted a rapid protection assessment with refugees, including persons with disabilities, at Hamdai Transit Center. The main findings show that there is lack of information around available service, girls and women not feeling safe due to rumors of gender-based incidents, the urgent request for hygiene kit to mitigate exposure to COVID-19. Also, they reported that no specific mechanism are put in place to target refugees with disabilities. They didn't receive information about protection, reporting, and response system, nor the responsible organization. Also, many violation cases have been reported in both camps during the interviews, particularly with relation to the distribution of food and other items. Persons with disability have to do the queues like everyone else, However, queues are not respected, and people with disability are scared of being pushed in crowds when they, which make them among the last people to receive aid. We put many recommendations to humanitarian actors, to the government, to UN agencies. Some of these recommendations are urgent and others are midterm recommendations. In our urgent recommendations, we would urgently provide accessible informative materials and accessible channels of communication, urgently provide assistive devices and rehabilitation service, provide financial support in form of cash transfer, provide a diversity of food, especially for persons with disability with high support needs. And in our midterms recommendation, we will establish an inclusive registration and data collection system. And here we recommend the use of Washington Group short set of questions, review the sectoral policy tools to be aligned with ISASC guidelines on disability inclusion, and also to promote inclusion in CAM leadership and management. Also, we have some recommendation to the government to review policies and reform legal frameworks, improve the level of coordination with humanitarian actors, and to address the needs of persons with disability at the start of the emergency, and to, and to ensure the participation of persons with disabilities in the whole process. The recommendation to the United Nations to raise awareness among UN and other humanitarian organizations about the national frameworks and available service at the national level, develop partnership with organizations of persons with disabilities working in humanitarian actions. Our recommendation to the organization of persons with disabilities include inclusion of displaced persons with disabilities in advocacy plans, and to invite them to coordinate with humanitarian stakeholders and share information, to establish partnership with humanitarian actors to support their inclusion. So to support mobilizing displaced persons with disabilities, and to contribute to building the capacity of humanitarian actors and government officials, and raise public awareness about the rights and needs of displaced persons with disabilities. For more information about the report and the full report, follow up on the social media. There's a full accessible version about the report. Yeah, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to participate.
Thank you so much, Rahama. And I see we have some questions already coming in for you, which we will take during the Q&A session after the panel discussion. Thank you so much for that. Moving on now to our next speaker, we have a presentation of the report by the Special Rapporteur team, its findings and key recommendations. I'm delighted to introduce Will Pons. Will is currently serving as Senior Legal Advisor and Researcher to the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, where his portfolio includes armed conflict, humanitarian action, international criminal law, and peace building. Will also serves as Research Associate at the Harvard Law School Project on Disability, where he conducts research and analysis to develop innovative approaches for the protection of persons with disabilities prior to, during, and after armed conflict and humanitarian crises. Will previously served as a legal advisor with the ICRC Washington delegation, where he worked on various issues related to armed conflict, immigration, disability, and humanitarian assistance. He has published a number of articles on public international law, including armed conflict and disability, and has an upcoming publication on prosecuting crimes against persons with disabilities as crimes against humanity. Over to you, Will.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everyone. I have the distinct honor of presenting to you sort of the purpose, process, conclusions, and recommendations of SR Gerard Quinn's report on the protection and participation of persons with disabilities in the context of the peace continuum. Next slide, please. What we'll do first is discuss the process to sort of give you an idea of where the thinking was and what we used to develop the report. What was done first was a literature review and background document that was used to inform and draft the UNSR's report. And it was research, and the research and writing was done for that background document by myself and my colleague, Janet Lord. The review and analysis examined the impact of armed conflict on persons with disabilities, the protections provided to them by international humanitarian law, IHL, the application and interpretation of the obligations established by Article 11 of the CRPD as determined and interpreted by OHCHR, the CRPD committee, and the UN Security Council. The background document also assessed the concept of protection of persons with disabilities in armed conflict, including the accountability for crimes against persons and involvement in the disarmament, demobilization, reintegration initiative, as well as the overall UN system engagement on persons with considering persons with disabilities and
I think we have a technical issue.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you again, Will. Continue, please.
Apologies. Basically, we're considering persons with disabilities and along with intersecting identities such as gender, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, religion, among others. Lastly, the background document also included emerging practices and protection of persons with disabilities in armed conflicts that were found through the literature review, the calls for input, and expert consultation. On May 12th, 2021, the UNSR sent out a request for input to inform his thematic report on the protection of current application. Okay, I'm being asked to turn off the video, so hopefully that will help. 1 second. Okay, so the UNSR sent out for inputs to inform the thematic report and basically examine. These questionnaires were sent out to states, military authorities, and civil society. A healthy number of responses were received, and these were integrated into the background document, and then these inputs can be found online. On the 4th of June, 2021, UNSR held an expert consultation with international humanitarian law, Humanitarian Action, and experts on the rights of persons with disabilities from state, civil societies, organizations of disabilities, UN entities, military institutions, academia. The findings of these meetings then informed and were integrated into the report that was then presented by the UNSR on the 21st of October, 2021. Next slide, please. The focus of the report was threefold. First, to build on the UN Security Council Resolution 2475 and to reinforce the application of the CRPD via Article 11 along all phases of the peace conflict continuum. Second, it was to frame the concept of protection to include the active involvement of persons with disabilities in humanitarian action, conflict prevention, reconciliation, reconstruction, and peace building. And third was to facilitate and inform a broader dialogue about the visibility continuum. Next slide, please. The three main conclusions that came out of the report were related to the fragmentation of international law and how it must be avoided, the reframing of protection to be grounded in humanitarian agency and participation of persons with disabilities, and lastly, that the CRPD must be recognized as relevant across the entire peace continuum. To avoid fragmentation of law and to ensure coherence of that international law, the trend of reading the CRPD alongside other treaty regimes, policies, and programs was suggested to be continued and strengthened. The CRPD applies at all times, not simply during peacetime. It does not allow for the derogation or suspension of its provisions during national emergency, foreign occupation, natural disaster, or armed conflict. The legacy of paternalism needs to be purged from the concept of protection and needs to focus on linking the active human agency and participation of persons with disabilities, goals of inclusion and development. What this means is that it must rely on norms of personhood, human agency, and the right of persons with disabilities to participate in and help reshape their own societies as established by the CRPD. Lastly, Article 11 of the CRPD makes convention relevant at all times. No aspects of the treaty should be understood to apply in isolation. This means that to truly and effectively and sustainably, to be effective and sustainable, the rights of persons with disabilities and their participation must be explicit in the laws and policies connected with the maintenance of peace and the reestablishment of peace in post-conflict situations. Articles 11 and C4 of the CRPD.
Will, I'm sorry, you were losing the connection to you again. Can you hear me?
Like the peace continuum and when disability next.
I think we have lost Will there again. So what I suggest is that we maybe move on to our video piece, and maybe we'll try to reconnect with us and get to present the last piece of his report presentation. So Erin, could I ask that we get the video ready? We're going to play a short video now for you from Rosemary Kayes. Rosemary is the Vice Chair of the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. She is a human rights lawyer and Director of Engagement at the Disability Innovation Institute at UNSW, and also a teacher in the UNSW Faculty of Law. And we have a short video now from Rosemary.
Sorry, just give me 1 minute. It seems to be taking a minute.
Sure. While we're waiting for that, just to remind people to keep posting your questions in the Q&A function. And after the video from Rosemary, we will move on to our panel discussion. I've just got a message from Will that his connection should be okay. So I think after, are we going to move to our video first?
Yes, it should be ready now. Okay. Just give me-
Okay, thank you, Erin. There is no sound with the video. If we could look at that.
Apologies.
That's okay.
Obligations contained within Article 11. Hello, as Chair of the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, I welcome the report by the Special Rapporteur of the thematic study on the rights of persons with disabilities in armed conflict. The report assesses the protection of persons with disabilities in the context of armed conflict and examines the current application of specific obligations contained within Article 11 of the Convention. It effectively draws together components of the CRPD with the United Nations Disability Inclusion Strategy. The report focuses on the provision of Article 11, situations of risk and humanitarian emergencies, and the obligations on states to take into account the protection and promotion of the human rights of persons with disabilities in all policies and programs. This provides a framework to guide state obligations as well as the complementary action and roles of the United Nations in areas of armed conflict. This utilisation and application of the standards and principles of CRPD, the specialist law in the area of disability, is a welcome contribution to the broader efforts to ensure coherence and reduce the fragmentation of international law. This reinforces the universality of international human rights law and ensures that there is consistent application of CRPD standards and principles for all people with disability in all situations. Triggered by the definitions contained within humanitarian law, the standards and principles of the Convention guide the actions of states, the UN and third-party actors to ensure the protection of the rights of persons with disabilities in situations of armed conflict. Fundamental to this is the universal recognition of the human agency of persons with disabilities to be actively involved in all processes affecting them. The committee looks forward to the next two reports in the series on international humanitarian law, which will examine disability and the conduct of hostilities, and then the final report in the series on disability and peace building. These are important areas of rights protection. The committee will utilise this framework to inform our engagement with states parties, its jurisprudence and reporting processes. We look forward to the inputs of civil society and people with disabilities from today's panel. I wish you every success today. Thank you.
And thank you to Rosemary for sending us that video piece. I think we can now maybe attempt to go back to Will to get you to present your conclusions, if your connection is a bit better.
Yeah, apologies. I just plugged it straight into the wired cord, so we should be just fine now. So my apologies, everyone. To rely on Wi-Fi during the presentation, maybe not the best of ideas. Okay, so we'll go through the conclusion slide, and then we'll move on. So I think just the three main conclusions are, the first one is to avoid fragmentation and ensure the coherence of international law. The trend of reading the CRPD alongside other treaty regimes, policies, and programs must be continued and strengthened. It is clear that the CRPD applies at all times, not simply during peacetime. It does not allow for the derogation or suspension of its provisions during national emergency, foreign occupation, natural disaster, and of course, armed conflict. The legacy of paternalism that has been throughout the idea of protection needs to be purged. Instead, there needs to be a focus on the linking of active human agency and participation of persons with disabilities to the goals of inclusion and development. This means that relying on the norms of personhood, human agency, and the right of persons with disabilities to participate in and help shape their own societies is essential and is established by the CRPD. Article 11 of the CRPD makes the convention relevant at all times, and no aspects of the treaty should be understood to apply in isolation. This means that to truly effectively and sustainably be sustainable in the development of peace and the protection of persons with protection of the rights of persons with disabilities or armed conflict, persons with disabilities need to be active in the participation, and that participation must be made explicit in the laws and policies connected with the maintenance of peace and the reestablishment of peace and post-conflict situations. So Article 11 and Article 4C of the CRPD apply across the peace continuum, and importantly, the UN Disability Strategy allows for the application of disability inclusion throughout all of UN actions. Next slide, please. There are a number of recommendations to the UNSR's report. I'm going to go through each one of them. I'm going to pick out pieces. This presentation will be shared, so my notes will be available so you can see all of the recommendations a bit more in detail. They're also available on the report if you want to read them in their original form. So the first recommendation was based on conflict prevention, but it's important to note that this report and its findings and recommendations are not meant to be prescriptive. Obviously, they are giving guidance and to expand discussion to ensure that the solutions and processes are made context specific as they need to be to fit the situation. In terms of conflict prevention, one of the main issues is that future UN resolutions to establish peace and political missions and UN Security Council resolutions should incorporate explicit language, giving a prominent role to persons with disabilities in conflict prevention and resolution. Also, the raising of awareness within states and multilateral organizations that persons with disabilities and their representative organizations have a vested interest in the maintenance of peace and have the capacity and expertise to help avoid conflicts is an important way forward. On the point of conduct of hostilities, state military should, in consultation with persons with disabilities and their representative organizations, develop specific protections for persons with disabilities at a strategic, tactical, and operational levels. Additionally, state militaries need to increase their engagement with and actively seek the expertise of persons with disabilities and their representative organizations in order to obtain the right appropriate knowledge and expertise so that they can utilize a disability perspective in their operations and the development of their policies and practices. On terms of international criminal law, in line with the call to end the impunity made by the UN Security Council Resolution 2475, states, multilateral institutions, investigators, prosecutors should all give greater attention to the disability dimension in existing and future investigations, commissions of inquiry, and trials for war crimes and crimes against humanity. As was stated before the introduction, at the part of the introduction, there is a forthcoming article that I authored with the Harvard Law School Project on Disability in the American Journal for International Law that discusses this exact process and how to move forward, and will be part of one of the new reports coming out for the UNSR probably in 2023. Humanitarian action. This is an area that actually has seen positive growth in terms of where the disability inclusion is being provided and participation of persons with disabilities and the use of their expertise and knowledge have been assessed. So positive steps have been taken, but what happens is there needs to be a real link between protection, humanitarian action, and development. So states and multilateral organizations and humanitarian organizations must ensure that their programming is disability inclusive in all aspects, not just certain aspects. This is ensuring the reduction of fragmentation, as we spoke about earlier, is that and that none of the rights and obligations need to be understood, should not be understood in an isolated fashion. Steps should be taken to ensure active participation and consultation with persons with disabilities and their representatives organizations as state multilateral organizations and humanitarian organizations seek to provide disability inclusive humanitarian action. Next slide, please. The last 4 recommendations relate to disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. I'm going to refer to this as DDR, just as it's a little bit simpler to say. States and multilateral institutions should support disability inclusive DDR programming, recognizing that ex-combatants with disabilities have an equal right to help rebuild their own communities. An example of an area where this would be included and possibly move forward is through UN Mine Action, where there is a lot of potential to be more inclusive of persons with disabilities and to apply a human rights-based approach. Peacekeeping. UN peacekeeping and special political missions should develop concrete plans for implementation of the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy, including engagement with and the building capacity of organizations with persons with disabilities. As stated prior, as for one of the other recommendations, UN resolutions establishing new or renewing missions for peacekeeping should include appropriate language to integrate disability inclusion as a cross-cutting issue through their mandate, including the recognition of the importance of disability expertise and the use of a disability inclusive protection advisors, disability analysis, and the collection and use of disaggregated data based on disability. Peace building. The constructive role of persons with disabilities in peace building must be highlighted, and practical suggestions need to be made on how to enhance the future involvement. Persons with disabilities and their representative organizations have the right to be meaningfully engaged in the process of peace building and in post-conflict situations, as they provide a critical insight in how to achieve an inclusive society and economy when you build back better. Lastly, capacity building. Much needs to be done to enable militaries to gain insight in both the protection and participation of persons with disabilities before, during, and after conflict. Additionally, much needs to be done to build the capacity of persons with disabilities and their representative organizations to enable them to interact effectively with governments and the militaries and relevant parts of the UN system to optimize the role of such organizations across the peace continuum. Next slide, please. The next steps that will be taken by the UNSR and his mandate will be a report to the UN General Assembly in 2022 on the conduct of hostilities and disability. This plans to establish concrete recommendations on how militaries can, at the strategic, tactical, and operational levels, develop specific protections for persons with disabilities during active hostilities. The second report, as I alluded to earlier, will be in 2023 on peace building and disability. This report is still sort of in the planning process, but will have a focus on transitional justice in post-conflict. And both of these reports are meant to build on this most recent report that we're talking about today in order to provide the concrete recommendations and examples of either good practices by states and multilateral institutions and civil society, but also how to improve on it and advance the recommendations and findings of the current report. Next slide, please. This is just to reach out. So if I know that we have a number of individuals here with quite a bit of interest on this topic. The first email is the UNSR's direct email to the office at OHCHR. The second email is my own email, and the third email is my colleague Janet Lord's email. If you have questions, concerns, inputs, thoughts, please feel free to share them with us, as this is a process that we want to involve civil society in, as you are the most important aspect of this and the implementers of this and the people on the ground that will be discussing and directly interacting with militaries and states, as well as providing advice and guidance on disability inclusion. So thank you for your time. Again, I apologize for the terrible connection. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Will, and well done on recovering back there. Technology is always presenting us with some challenges. We are tight on time, so I'm going to move on now to our panel discussion. Just a reminder for people to keep your questions coming in through the Q&A function. I'm delighted now to hand over to Gerard Quinn. Gerard was appointed the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities by the Human Rights Council at its 45th session in October 2020. Mr. Quinn was the lead focal point for the global network of national human rights institutions during much of the negotiations of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. His current research interests include theories of personhood and new technology, intersectionality between age and disability, extreme poverty and disability, and the protection of persons with disability during armed conflicts. Over to you for the panel discussion, Gerard.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I hope my technology holds up here. And let me say at the outset, I'm deeply grateful to all the co-organizers of today's workshop. We had an interactive dialogue with states last week on the thematic report, but this dialogue with you is equally important, if in fact not more important, in broadening and deepening the conversation and keeping it alive. The conversation, of course, was started by others, the Office of the High Commission, the International Commission of the Red Cross, and the Geneva Academy, who've done tremendous work in this field. So we're basically trying to keep that conversation alive and keep it moving forward. And as Will said, the key point to us is the inflection point in the convention from viewing persons with disabilities as objects to be passively maintained or protected, to subjects with human agency, all of their own, with a right to be involved and participate in all points along the peace continuum. By the way, that's terminology used by the UN Secretary General himself. Last week at the interactive dialogue, we were vividly reminded that the United Nations is carved up into three distinct pillars: development, security, and human rights. And the very fascinating thing about disability in conflict is it brings all of these three pillars together. And this was commented on fulsomely by many of the states who participated. So to help us move the conversation forward, we have 4 speakers on a panel divided into 3 categories. Our first speaker speaks from the ground. He is Hatim Al-Saka, who is involved with disability rights in Palestine and has contributed to many reports, including a 2020 report for Human Rights Watch on disability in conflict in Palestine. And then we have 2 speakers from the International Committee of the Red Cross, which of course is the keeper of the flame in terms of international humanitarian law. So it's immensely gratifying to see the International Committee of the Red Cross engaged. Our first speaker is Ngwa Michael Muwenda, who is Disability Inclusion Advisor to the International Committee of the Red Cross, and then Alexander Breitinger, who's Legal Advisor to the ICRC. You're very welcome. And last but not least, to try and broaden our horizons, we have Diane Richler of immense experience in Inclusion International and indeed IDA, but also immense practical experience on the ground on other sides of the peace continuum, including particularly the peace building process. So we have 2 or 3 questions to put to the panelists, and I'll be very brief. Let me ask you, and I will go through each of you individually. Given your own advocacy strategies and priorities and efforts, how can you use this report to broaden or advance those advocacy efforts and broaden and maintain the conversation? So we'll go to Michael Muwenda first. Michael, over to you.
Thank you very much, Gerard, and thank you for all of you it's a pleasure to be part of this particular conversation. As ICRC, we do very much welcome the report on the rights of persons with disabilities in armed conflict. And of course, we echo the foundations of the report that recognizes the rebalancing of the traditional protection agenda that promotes equality and personhood. We, as ICRC, will use this report or purpose to use this report in various ways, in as far as developing the capacities of persons with disabilities is concerned, especially in relation to engagement with militaries. So we're going to use this report as part and parcel of a complementary document on our own Vision 2030. And of course, we realize that the report is fully in line with our Vision 2030 on disability, whereby we endeavor to promote inclusion and participation of persons with disabilities in our processes, services, and programs. Based on our recognition of the active human agency of persons with disabilities. Now, what I would like also to point out here is that our own Vision 2030 for disability inclusion in ICRC is actually a 4-pronged, what we call pillars, a 4-pronged approach to disability inclusion. And therefore, in this particular area, we are going to ensure that the report inspires our aspirations as well as commitments to ICRC. And of course, I will give details if there is need, in subsequent questions. Thank you for now.
Thank you very much, Michael. That's really gratifying to hear. Before I go on to Alexander, let me first of all return to Haitham Al-Saka. The floor is yours. Haitham, are you there?
السلام عليكم. في البداية أود أن أشكر الجميع.
Good morning. At the beginning, I'd like to thank everyone for this event. I'm very happy that I'm representing the persons who were affected by the armed conflicts. As a person with disabilities living in Gaza, I work in an organization. I work in an organization in Palestine who works with people with disabilities in Gaza. We found that lots of people there with disabilities, and we all came together and we had a talk about our experience and the challenges, especially the challenge of the blockade that has been going for 14 years. the only chance I had in my life to go outside of Gaza was in 2017 when I went to the Council of Human Rights, and I reflected on the aggressions and the challenges that has been going on, especially against the protests, the peaceful protests starting since 2014. In the independent investigation committee, they found that it was impossible for the snipers, Israeli snipers, to distinguish between these peoples within the people with disability and other people. And they found that the people with disabilities had been targeted intentionally. The report calls on states and governments to apply the protection of people with disabilities. According to our experience in Gaza, we found that such people, they don't enjoy protection. In the last aggression, the use of warning missiles or bombs didn't take people with disabilities into consideration. For example, deaf people, they couldn't hear the explosion, and the thing that prevented them of going to a safer place. The recent aggression on Gaza prevented moving while conflicts, while clashes. The thing that prevented the people with disabilities to move around or even go outside of Gaza for medical treatment. We always have been calling, especially after the aggression that happened in 2014, that the measures already established are not enough to protect people with disabilities. One of these ladies of the disabilities was killed because she was not able to be evacuated quickly. She was 17 years old, and she was disabled, and because of the smoke around her, she couldn't find her way and she couldn't escape. Therefore, the humanitarian organizations should take into consideration the participation of the people with disabilities in planning of all issues and empower these people in making decisions and in setting the plans and the development. We need to listen to these people. I myself, I live in Gaza. I'm representing my voice and the voice of these people with disabilities, and the importance of these voices in places of armed conflict, just like Syria and Yemen and other places. We seriously are emphasizing that there should be accountability, real accountability, and taking our recommendations in a real way in providing places for emergency for disabled people. One story that we heard it from the father of one blind person that tells that this person spent most of his day in the school because he didn't have access to the other utilities. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Haitham. I think there's a few things coming out of that. These are classic international humanitarian law issues, like the distinction between civilian and military objectives, the principle of no adverse distinction, the principle of accessible evacuation, and also the key role of voice or the absence of voice in many of these processes. So thank you very much for that. Alexander, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Gerard. And it's also a great pleasure and honor to be here. Just from the perspective and picking up on the speakers that have preceded before me, the current report is really a great tool in its analysis and also in its diagnostic of the current state of international humanitarian law as it applies to persons with disabilities in armed conflict. And we wholeheartedly agree, really, that the main issue is indeed to sufficiently effectively apply the existing IHL protections to address the risks and needs of persons with disabilities during the conduct of hostilities. And here, especially, we're of course, talking about the protections of civilians. That I should say also applies to both states parties and non-states parties to armed conflict as well. So international humanitarian law is really, in that sense, very much complementary to the CRPD. And we also agree with the recommendations relating to the integration of a disability perspective in military doctrine, training, and practice as a very practical way forward. And we support very much the idea of further engagement on these issues. So we're looking indeed forward to the process leading up to the next report in 2022. And for purposes of international humanitarian law, it's really precautionary obligations in the conduct of hostilities that provide a very useful entry point, because this is about feasible positive measures militaries can take to avoid or minimize harm for civilians arising from military operations. And here, what is feasible includes what is practically possible on account of all the information that would be relevant to military commanders, including humanitarian as well as military information. And to the production of humanitarian information in this regard, we can all contribute, all those that are present today, persons with disabilities themselves, their representative organizations, humanitarian organizations, civil society, as well as academia, experts, the CRPD committee. So on this basis, we are really looking forward to further elaborating on some of these issues that also speakers before me have already outlined and that are touched upon in the report, like mistakes in targeting, specific harm incurred by persons with disabilities through the use of certain ordnance, inaccessible evacuation procedures, or unavailability of family members or support persons for their support, as well as humanitarian relief being inaccessible. And we should provide for opportunities so that militaries will be able to hear directly also from the lived experiences of persons with disabilities, as well as selecting military experts across regions and with a wide variety of military operations as well. So I'll leave it at that at this juncture, but happy to elaborate more. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Alexander. I'm very much reminded of the words of Rosemary Case in her video, which is that what we're really involved in here is trying to achieve the maximum coherence of international law and a reduction of fragmentation. So it's really gratifying to see the ICRC engaged in that process. And I do agree with you that maximum feasible precautionary measures need to be investigated a lot more in conjunction with the voices that count, like people with disabilities speaking directly to military and other authorities. So last but certainly not least, over to you, Diane.
Thank you. And first of all, I'd like to extend my congratulations to the Special Rapporteur and the team for this incredible report. I think that Gerard Quinn, during the negotiations of the convention and now in his role as Special Rapporteur, has kept us stretching our minds about what the rights of persons with disabilities really means. And I think that this report is really an example of moving beyond previous thinking. Will made the point about the CRPD being relevant across the entire peace continuum. And I thought it was interesting hearing the comment about the UN Secretary General referring to the 3 pillars of the UN being human rights, development, and security. And when I think back to the days of the negotiations of the convention, there was a lot of debate between different organizations about whether the convention should be a human rights treaty or whether it should be a development treaty. Some people really wanted the focus to be on services. Other people wanted it to be on rights. I don't recall any conversations about security. And I think that it's really important to place this report in the context of the entire human rights, the entire UN system, and to think about the interface between rights development and security. I think in the case of rights, part of the change that we've seen occurring because of increased understanding of the convention is from thinking about persons with disabilities as simply being complainants. People, identifying how they've been deprived of rights and having mechanisms in order to be able to have their rights recognized. In the case of development, I think that one of the real problems that we've seen in many places is that organizations of persons with disabilities, when they've identified a need for a service, have been given the responsibility for operating that service. And that's taken them away from their advocacy roles. And it's deprived them of an ability to be much more engaged in broader democratization processes, which in the context of this current series of reports relates a lot to peace building. In the context of security, I thought it was valuable to think about the different stages of ensuring security, because preventing hostilities or dealing with the situation of persons with disabilities during hostilities is one thing, but post-conflict, there's a huge challenge in society for creating the kind of networks, the kind of weaving together of very conflicted positions to create a situation where peace can exist. And I think that, that also relates to the multiple identities of persons with disabilities. Will mentioned a few that are often thought about, now we're used to thinking about gender or sexual orientation or ethnicity. We don't often think about political affiliation. And the fact is that persons with disabilities and their families also have historic identities that are tied to different political positions. And the experience that we've had through Inclusion International is that often when you're able to focus on the common identification of problems, on the common identification of needs, you can actually break through some of those entrenched political positions and political identities. And it's only when that starts to happen and people start to develop common goals and common perspectives that you can really ensure a lasting peace. That peace can't simply be a process of truce where the existing conflicts between different political positions are just kept at a low simmer. But really, what's needed is a way to engage citizens in a way that they will be able to contribute to a more inclusive society. And you know, that's definitely challenging, but it really is a way to overcome a lot of the tensions that have existed in the past. And our experience is that because people with disabilities, regardless of political affiliation or history, may share similar kinds of objectives, that disability may be a rallying point and a way of bringing people together in ways that other identities don't. So hopefully that's something that will be pursued in especially the third report on peace building. But I think the role of organizations of persons with disabilities, the agency of persons with disabilities, is something that can be a thread throughout the process.
Thank you very much, Diane. What I really loved in that is your focus on the link between disability rights and democratization, which of course is a process, a long-term process, and the idea of disability as a kind of a solvent that provides a safe ground for some sectarian divisions to be at least muted, if not dissolved. That doesn't mean that we don't carry into the discussions our own political point of view. So I know time is running out. I want to go back to each of you, all four of you, and just ask a very simple question. What more is needed in terms of voices that should be at the table and research that we need to be doing to drive the process forward? So I begin with Michael, and let me begin again with Michael, if you are there, Michael.
Thank you very much, Gerard. I always like making reference to our Vision 2030. And I would like to note that ICRC actually has made quite some advancements in as far as disability inclusion is concerned in general, and specifically, especially on the participation of persons with disabilities, whereby the implementation of our vision is overseen by a full-time disability inclusion advisor, and of course constitutes a move away from the medical model of rehabilitating victims of war, hitherto embodied by ICRC's interventions implemented by the physical rehabilitation program. And in as far as participation is concerned, of course, as an organization, we aim to implement this vision. We recognize the pivotal role played by persons with disabilities in the entire peace continuum. To this end, discussions are ongoing with the International Disability Alliance, IDA, to develop engagement protocols with persons with disabilities and their representative organizations to guide this noble process. And just as some form of conclusion, I would like to note that ICRC, we look forward as an organization to holding discussions and engage with various stakeholders on how we can engage and support further discussions on how persons with disabilities can engage with the military. This is indeed quite important because we believe it's one of the gaps that we have as of the moment. And for this sort of engagement to be possible, of course, we are aware that the assessment and development of capacities of OPDs in the peace continuum is key. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. And I love the work that you're doing with IDA. That's a very good sign for the future. Haitham, do you want to add anything about voices being at the table and what kind of knowledge and research we need to be developing to move things forward? Just waiting for Haitham.
مرحبا مرة أخرى.
Hi again. The recommendations in this concern, there are many. The report gave us lots of points that we need to work on. We always talk that 2030 is impossible without us. We need to be involved in solving the challenges and bridging the gaps, consulting the persons with disabilities and their participation in all levels of making decisions was recommended by Secretary General. The thing should be recommended by the Secretary General, so that the thing that can ensure the participant of these persons and the persons who are in harm in the conflict situations. I was happy to give my expertise on the persons with disabilities in Gaza. Again, we need to work on the obstacles that prevent our participation. For example, we in Gaza, there are lots of issues that prevent our participation. One of them is the blockade that has been going on for 14 days. The laws still cannot stop this blockade. The thing that prevents us from giving our expertise and how we bridge the gaps and the challenges, especially at the time of these aggressions, continued Israeli aggressions. Today, participation is the best way. Today, I had a participation about the protection of persons with disabilities, and we discussed how we can empower these people and enabling them to express their influence. This gives us the basement or the land for preparing the situation for cases of emergencies. People with different types of disabilities in Gaza have been affected a lot by all these aggressions, so they should be listened to. Also, there should be infrastructure and shelters, so these people with disabilities can resort to. UNRWA should have some shelters and schools to receive these peoples and to take into considerations how these places are really providing service for these persons. The last recommendation is that to prevent any violation of the rights of the people with disabilities. Following this subject and these violations on international level, according to the according to the Security Council resolutions, and following all these who committed all these crimes and compensating these who were harmed. Thank you, Gerard, for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Haitham. It's great to be reminded that we don't all live in ideal, responsive democratic orders, that countries in tension, even low intensity conflict, there are many complications in hearing the voices of people with disabilities, but we have to start thinking about that. I will go past you, Alexandra, because I assume Michael has spoken from the ICRC perspective. So rush therefore to Diane to hear last words on knowledge gaps and voice.
Thank you. I think that one challenge is the question of representation. And I think all too often an individual who has a disability or a family member of an individual who has a disability is invited to be part of a process or inserts themselves into a process, but it's not always clear that they're representing a consensus position. And our experience is that building consensus is not a simple process. These issues, the whole, especially for people who have lived through extreme conflicts, protracted conflicts, many of them have not had any experiences in even the simplest forms of democracy. In very stable situations, from the time children are in school, they elect someone who's going to help the teacher erase the blackboard, or they, make a decision about what game they're going to play at recess. But most people in conflict situations have not grown up with that kind of sense of the democratic process, of give and take, of consensus building. That takes time, and it also takes investment. Our experience is that you can't just focus on saying we're going to build capacity to be able to engage in a peace process. You have to first of all build the consensus, and developing that consensus takes time. And it's important that a person who's representing an organization of persons with disabilities takes their accountability to that group really seriously. That being elected to represent a group in a process is not carte blanche to promote your own positions. And sometimes that can be very difficult when the consensus position is not exactly what the leader would have promoted if they had been writing the position. So I think that whole issue of representation, of consensus building and capacity building about participating in democracy. It's not necessarily capacity building about international law, although that will come. But an even earlier stage is capacity building about working together, about collaboration, about building consensus. And that's really what democracy is about. It's about making sure that people can have their voices heard, and that a decision is taken by the group as a whole. But that takes time and it takes money.
Thank you so much, Diane. I think you've vividly demonstrated the linkage between development in a structural sense with security and human rights. I know, Sarah, time is running out, but I want to turn it back to you and see, do you want to gather up one or two questions before we ask Ellen to sum up?
Thank you so much, Gerard, and thanks to our panelists. I'm just having a look through here for some questions. We are about 6 minutes away from our time up. There is a question from Kirsten Lang that Rahama had said she would like to answer this question live. And Kirsten is interested in what issues were identified for refugees and IDPs who are not living in camps. Rahama, would you take a moment to answer that question, please?
Yeah, for refugees who are not living in the camps, as you know, Sudan faces multiple challenges due to political instability and economic situation, including over 200 annual inflation, currency depreciation, and fuel shortage. And the majority of refugees and asylum seekers face high level of poverty, limited access to livelihood opportunities, and are hosted in poorest areas of the country, where host communities are also struggling. While refugees often benefit from general support provided by host communities, in Sudan there are limited local resources and services that are available for refugees with disabilities. Yeah.
Thank you, Rahama. And I see there are a number of other questions for you in terms of how disability was assessed. Was it self-identification or identification of children by their families? There's other questions around issues faced by children with disabilities are similar to those presented. So I think there have been links placed in the chat box to the report you presented on, and also to Gerard's report and to Hatham's intervention at the UN in 2017. So I think if people have any further questions, unfortunately we are running out of time, that maybe they could use the contacts in those reports to send those questions directly. So I think that is more or less us for today. I want to thank everybody for their participation, for your attendance, all our speakers, etc., and our interpreters. I'm going to now hand over for closing remarks to Elham Yousefian. Elham is the Inclusive Humanitarian Action and Disaster Risk Reduction Advisor with the International Disability Alliance. She ensures strategic leadership, coordination, provision of technical expertise and advice to optimize the impact of IDA's work in inclusive humanitarian action and disaster risk reduction. Elham also has a diverse experience in protection and human rights, with a focus on issues related to human trafficking, refugees, domestic violence, and discrimination against persons with disabilities. Over to you, Elham.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you very much, everyone. I appreciate your participation in today's meeting. To be very brief, listening to all the presentations and contributions, we just realized that we got the first of a series of 3. So if we want to define and take some action points from this meeting, I would say, first of all, make sure to understand the report, read the report, and include the report in any capacity building activities that we have. I'm sure some of our colleagues from organizations of persons with disabilities are here, who are organizing capacity building activities for their members. And I would suggest that all of us include the recommendations of the report findings in our capacity building, so persons with disabilities are aware. And consider changing the assumption that this report is just for organizations or the civil society who are working in conflict situations. Every country has a military, and where there is a military, there is opportunity for implementation of this report and the other pieces of the report that are forthcoming in 2022 and 2023. So I would recommend to the civil society and organizations of persons with disabilities to consider including advocacy with the military, with those who are responsible to do the evacuation, rehabilitation, and the support to those who are affected by conflict, to make sure that their activities and their implementation is inclusive and accessible for persons with disabilities. And we do need a lot of research and evidence gathering. I was thinking today, listening to the meeting, that if we could have a survey in some of the militaries about their knowledge on disability, that would help a lot to build the future actions of what the military, what those who are responsible to provide, for example, warnings when military action happen, would show a lot the gap that we face in terms of knowledge and capacity on disability inclusion. And of course, I really welcome this conversation about democratization, because I think, first of all, democracy would be a very strong tool to prevent war and conflict. And hopefully none of these recommendations would be of use. And I think persons with disabilities, as 15% of the world's population, can participate and play an important role in prevention of conflict, or preventing the escalation of the conflict by including the understanding of democracy and democratization in their future action plans. So I think we all have a lot to do. I would say, let's spend a few minutes, a few hours, and think about a few very concrete action points each of us, based on our organizations, can do to implement this report. I thank you again. Special thanks to Sarah, our fantastic moderator, and everyone, including my colleague Erin, the logistic team from the International Disability Alliance who helped fantastic technical facilitation of the event, and all of you for joining. There would be blog posts, including the recording to the meeting, and also PowerPoint presentation that William shared with all of you, and also publicly available on IDA website. So please stay tuned, follow us on social media, and we will share the future pieces of work with you. Thank you and have a wonderful day.